What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I had previously done Persona 5 Royal and Persona 4 Golden character tier lists following the more overarching discussion videos I did on those games. And I was going to do the same for Persona 3 Reload. However, after several attempts at recording that video, I found it to be way too difficult to rank every single character with all of their different contributions to the game onto a singular tier list. In addition to looking back on my previous character tier lists and thinking they definitely needed some rearrangement. So I'm completely scrapping my original plan to do an overarching P3 Reload character tier list, followed by sometime down the line a combined 3, 4, and 5 tier list, and instead I'm going to do 3 separate tier lists across all 3 of these games, including some spin-off characters here and there, starting with the main cast, followed by all of the social link characters that are not also main cast, of course, and finally the antagonists, which I think is the main component that was very hard to rank alongside the other characters. And so we have here for today's tier list all of the members of C's. We've got all the members of the investigation team, in addition to Marie, as well as Labrys. So while Marie could have been lumped into the non-main cast social link tier list, I kind of think it makes sense for her to be in the main cast conversation because of how prevalent she is to the true golden ending in P4G. Labrys is included because she is a very prominent character in Persona 4 Arena and Arena Ultimax, which is one of the few spin-offs I've played. You'll also notice we have all of the Phantom Thieves, followed by Sophia and Zenkichi, who are from Persona 5 Strikers. Persona 5 Strikers and Persona 4 Arena Ultimax are the only 2 Persona spin-offs I've played, and I actually have videos on them on the channel that you can check out, as well as the broader discussions on P5R, P4G, and P3R, which I would also encourage you to check out. But back to the spin-offs, I don't have much of an interest in checking out the spin-offs. They don't really draw me in the same way, although I was quite impressed with Strikers in particular. My main focus when it comes to Persona is the mainline titles, even though Persona is technically a spin-off series, but come on now, at this point it's its own series within the Megami Tensei franchise as a whole. But regardless, I am also including the Velvet Attendants. I think it makes more sense to rank these guys here than in the other ones, and also to try to balance out the number of things I'm ranking between these, although the antagonist tier list is going to be a noticeably smaller pool of characters to rank. I do hope that splitting things up like this will not only help the list make more sense from a viewer's point of view, but also make things easier on me as far as ranking things in a way that I think makes sense and represents what I have to say about each character. So let's establish the criteria for the tiers. This is something that people tend to get really hung up on because they see a D and they're like, oh, that's a 60% on a math quiz, but this is not so cut and dry. And so we'll start from the top. S tier is going to be the very top of the top of my favorite characters respective to this pool that I'm ranking from. I'm going to have to limit myself. Some of my favorite characters will end up being in the A tier because I want the S tier to mean a lot more, but A tier is a very strong ranking in this case. B tier is still going to be on the positive side. Just because it is in the middle does not mean that it means mid at all. It more so means, yeah, I like this character, but maybe it doesn't go beyond that. And then C tier is going to be kind of like the I don't dislike them, but not the biggest fan. And then D tier is going to be characters that I don't particularly care for. Don't know how many characters are going to end up ranking that low, but I guess it's more so there as a precaution. I would pay more attention to what I'm actually saying than the rankings. I just think that a tier list and ranking like this is a good way to frame a discussion about this many individual topics. I guess let's start with the protagonists, whom I've been very vocal about regarding their nature as self-inserts. I've gone into this some in my other Persona videos, but while these 3 being Makoto Yuki, Yu Narukami, and Ren Amamaya do serve as good self-inserts for the player in a gameplay context, I think from a narrative context, they're not given as much credit as I think they should be given as far as having their own personalities. Especially in my view, the Persona 3 protagonist plays a very distinct role in that story, to the point where I view him as being his own character. Now, I do think that Narukami is pretty easily the most blank slate of these 3, with Ren being somewhat more defined than him, but I'd go so far as to say Makoto Yuki is unironically one of my favorite characters in the series, especially among the characters that I'm ranking today. You've got a character with a tragic and mysterious backstory who has more or less given up on caring in life, who through the characters that he is forced to work together with to stop this ever-looming threat, which is the Dark Hour in Tartarus, Agis, whom he is one of the few that is actually capable of uncovering the mysteries of it because of his proficiency as a Persona user, grows to form a legitimate bond with each and every one of these characters. In addition to, of course, all of the social link characters that he encounters and interacts with throughout the game as well. I do think that his personality comes through a lot more in the way that he carries himself and also in the dialogue options, which you also see with P4 and P5 as well to varying degrees. But it's also something that is present in P3's characters generally, where many of them are made to grow on you over time. They start off very guarded, and a lot of the social links especially start off with very specific and somewhat mundane problems, but then it elevates into something that is more of a personality flaw that ends up getting resolved in part to the protagonist's encouragement of said character, or even tough love in some cases. It's something that some other characters in P3 admire about him, is his aloofness and his willingness to not be shaken in his resolve so easily. And it's due to that fearlessness that he is able to do what he needs to do. And it all culminates, of course, with that iconic and beautiful ending scene between him and Aigis. And so that's all to say that the P3 MC is an easy S tier for me. Such a big reason as to why P3 is my favorite among these three games. And you may notice that the upper two tiers might be pretty dominated by the P3 cast. Some people might view that as being biased towards P3, but it's actually the exact opposite to where P3 is my favorite, in part because of how much I like these characters. And so Narukami, I feel like there is the least to glean from Narukami as a personality. He definitely does have a sense of confidence about him, maybe a bit of aloofness as well, but definitely not as apathetic as P3's MC, which is good. I think that a big strength among all three of these games is that they do have very distinct tones and therefore bring something unique to the table, even if there are some frustrating similarities between them, particularly between P4 and P5, but you can hear more about that in my P5R discussion. And so I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I think Narukami is a pretty easy B tier. I like Narukami. Can't say I feel super strongly about him, so it's hard for me to put him in A. For Ren, he kind of comes across to me like the kid who's trying too hard to be an anime protagonist, except that when they go into the metaverse, he actually kind of is that. But in the day-to-day, it's almost like he's got kind of a coolness to him, but in more of a dorky way. And I do like that. I feel like this is going to have to be another B. Put him in B for now. It's hard for me to say whether I prefer him to Narukami or not. There are certain aspects to P4 that I've been softening on a little bit, and I've been feeling a little more critical of P5 as of late. It's almost like I'm going through what the fandom has gone through over the years, just at a much more accelerated rate. We'll just do that for now. There's the chance for rearranging stuff later. I just want to get more characters on the board first, because they could actually be contenders for A, depending on who else ends up there. Let's move on to Yukari. And while I have played Persona 3 FES, I do want to base this more so on Reload, which was extremely faithful, so I'm sure there's some things that were changed. I couldn't pinpoint the most specific details of what was changed in characterization, but Yukari is a character that I've always kind of liked, and I think is misunderstood in a lot of ways, and that is due in part to the answer, which has not been released for Reload yet in the form of episode Aigis. Because I'm not the biggest fan of the answer generally, I'm not really chomping at the bit to get my hands on episode Aigis either, so I'm fine with factoring that element of her character out. I guess that brings me into, there is way too much focus on continuity in this series, where obviously episode Aigis / the answer is intimately tied into the main P3 story, but when it comes to the spin-offs, I'm going to kind of pick and choose what elements of the spin-offs I like and dislike that may add or detract from certain characters, because I just don't put that much stock into the canonicity or relevancy of the spin-offs. Striker seems like a major exception as far as the quality of the characterization and lack of flanderization, but when it comes to Arena Ultimax, it did benefit some characters in certain ways and definitely didn't benefit other characters in other ways. I'm willing to throw literally any of that stuff out of my mind, because I'm just not nearly as interested in that element of Persona as I am the main games. Because Yukari is one of those characters that I think does benefit from her portrayal in Arena Ultimax, but even so, I like her characterization in the main game, in this case being Reload. Sure, she does take jabs at Junpei, but it's rarely unwarranted, and there are times where she does admit fault in going too far. I've always taken her friendship with Junpei as more of a friendly ribbing as opposed to something more mean-spirited, because Yukari definitely does have an attitude, but I think given her situation, it's understandable. I also think there are a number of qualities about Yukari that are admirable. Primarily, I think she's a very kind person, shown not only in her characterization, but also because she is the de facto healer for C's, and even her personality trait / combat characteristic for gameplay purposes is regarding healing the other party members, which definitely does portray a warmth and kindness through the gameplay. And while I don't want to factor in combat prowess, because that would heavily swing certain characters in certain directions on this list. I do think that it can be indicative of said character's personality in some ways. She has a keen intuition in that she felt like Mitsuru was hiding information from her and the other members of SEES, which she was. And of course, with her dad being so heavily involved with the matter of the Kirijo group and therefore SEES, the Dark Hour and Tartarus, etc., I think it is understandable how emotional she got at Yakushima regarding what we find out later on in the story as being a doctored video of her dad saying you have to kill the full moon shadows to get rid of the Dark Hour. And so yeah, I really like Yukari. She is going to go into the A tier. Let's do Morgana, who I can understand the annoyance towards because of Morgana's gameplay utilization being that of a walking, talking tutorial, essentially. Not only yapping your ear off about game mechanics you might already know that aren't skippable, or more notably telling you to go to bed, particularly in Vanilla P5, which I did play a solid amount of prior to playing Royal in full. I can definitely understand some of the distaste towards him because of that. You also have his little feud with the Ryuji and Morgana storming off and stuff like that. And I think from a pacing standpoint, that section kind of sucks, but narratively, it's not like Ryuji wasn't asking for it because he has been bullying Morgana in a way that is more than a friendly ribbing, like I was saying with Yukari and Junpei. It definitely did seem a lot more mean-spirited. And also you have to consider that while Morgana is technically some kind of shadow creature, he's still a cat. Now, how much of that is in his DNA from how he was created? Was he made to be extremely cat-like, not just in appearance in the real world, to be inconspicuous, or is that something that is more of an act at first or something? It seems like he has cat-like instincts, just kind of generally, so I do view Morgana as being a walking, talking cat, in a sense, and therefore I think that his pompousness and standoffishness at times is very indicative of what a cat would be like if it could communicate directly with humans. That doesn't mean you have to like Morgana because of that, but I do think it's an aspect that does tend to get overlooked when talking about his character, and also, while it might be annoying being tutorialized at by him, I also think Morgana doesn't get enough credit for his usefulness to the Phantom Thieves. The Phantom Thieves would be totally lost without him. Of course, later on you get characters like Makoto, who has a knack for logically figuring out certain things about the metaverse that Morgana was either going to explain or didn't realize himself. And then of course Futaba, who is the tech whiz, who's able to kind of dig into these things from another angle, in addition to her mother's involvement with the goings-on when it comes to that side of the story. But to start out, Morgana is basically Joker, Ryuji, and Ann's only source of info on the metaverse, and he was kind of made with that directive in mind in universe. While I'm not the biggest fan of a mascot character being a staple of the series, I do like Morgana as a character, especially once you get into Strikers, which I do think is a pretty accurate representation and extension of the Phantom Thieves characters from the main game, despite Royal being developed at the same time and all of that. Much of Royal's DNA is of Vanilla P5. But yeah, Strikers feels narratively a lot closer in quality when it comes to the story and character side of things compared to what I have experienced and seen and heard of the other spinoffs. And so I do actually think it is warranted to factor in some of that stuff when talking about the Phantom Thieves in particular. And without a lot of that tutorialization baggage, I like Morgana quite a bit more in Strikers because it just gets rid of a major negative for him. I will say that I always play Megami Tensei games with Japanese voices, so that may or may not be a factor because I personally find Morgana's English voice to be pretty grating. If anyone thinks that my lack of experience with the dub may decrease my affinity towards certain characters, I would actually say that it would probably be the opposite if I had played these games dubbed. And that's not any slight on anyone who enjoys the dubs in these games. They are definitely quality compared to a lot of the other slop that has been out there over the years, but this series is so Japan-centric that not only does it take me out of things, but I also just find certain voices to get on my nerves in the various dubs. Whereas in Japanese, it's not as much the case. I feel like I've softened on Morgana a bit, but I still do like him, so I'm gonna put him in B. Morgana just has more character going on than these two, so I'm gonna put him above. Now let's bounce back to P4 and do Yosuke. I enjoy Yosuke's presence in P4. From an actual characterization standpoint, I wouldn't say that I'm particularly wild about him. He definitely has some character flaws that I think could have stood to be woven in more with the main story, which is kind of a criticism a lot of people have of P4 and 5, since P3 weaves its characterization and character growth much more organically, I think, into the main story, as opposed to relegating most of that to the arc that they're introduced and then their social link, which you may or may not do. And I've done Yosuke Yosuke's social link twice at this point. I can understand that there are some problematic character flaws present in Yosuke's character, but that is something that a character could be written to grow out of. Also, I think something to consider is that he's a teenage boy, so of course he's insecure about his sexuality and all that when it comes to poking fun at kanji and whatever else you might point to. But I also think it's incredibly boring to just have characters be completely flawless. He does contribute some tension to the group that is much needed in P4, whether it be him and Chie butting heads, whether it be him jabbing at Kanji and Kanji overreacting back at him, or him swooning over Yukiko and Rise before promptly getting turned down and kind of backing off in a sense, except for the obligatory beach scene, I guess, that was added in Golden. Though I did kind of brush over the things that I do like about Yosuke. The responsibility he feels towards Saki's death, in that his dad, what is he, a manager or something for Junes, who's driving these local establishments out of business. And that gets somewhat into Saki's involvement because she's forced to work at Junes to try to make up for her family's failing liquor store, which ends up kind of tangentially resulting in her death. And he, I think, understandably feels somewhat responsible. He also was definitely trying to flirt with her, but I also think there's probably some element of him trying to be friendly towards her because he felt bad for what she was going through because of that guilt that he was feeling on behalf of Junes largely, even if it's not really directly his fault. And there's probably more to dig in with Yosuke's character here, but I wouldn't say that I feel super strongly about him, but I do like Yosuke. Now, above or below Narukami, I mean, Narukami has that protagonist cool factor, but Yosuke also has more depth to him for sure. So I'd probably put him above. And as far as him compared to Ren or even Morgana, I think the times that I like Morgana, I feel more strongly positively towards him than the moments that I most like Yosuke for. Even if Morgana might have more points where there are detractors, just looking at these two characters, I think I do like Morgana a little bit more than Yosuke. I also wouldn't pay the rankings within the tiers too much mind because we're just ranking a shit ton of characters here. So Ryuji, I do like Ryuji's more brash nature, especially when it comes to his portrayal in the vanilla game / Royal. I'm not as hot on his character in Strikers, not because he does anything wrong per se, but he just takes much more of a back seat in that game. And I think Strikers does a bit to reveal, in a sense, how contrived the prevalence of each of these characters is. It just depends on how much the writers want to focus on them. So some characters like Haru and An end up getting a more of a spotlight in Strikers, whereas characters like Ryuji and Makoto take a little bit more of a back seat compared to if we're just talking about their portrayal in Royal. And so I like Ryuji probably more than Yosuke, especially with the way that Ryuji is tied in with that first arc regarding Kamoshida and how personal it is to him, which you don't really find out until after the fact via his confidant. And then he does have more moments throughout the story, primarily almost blowing the Fan of Thieves cover. And then there was something where he had to sprint to, what was it, get to the exit of the metaverse or something. It's been over a year since I played P5R, so I'm a little fuzzy on some details. My point is he has some moments where he shines later on, but most of it is him just kind of brashly interrupting villain monologues and whatnot. And I do think that that brashness does get a little annoying at times. It does definitely help him stand out, albeit maybe in somewhat of a negative way at times. And that's kind of how he's perceived in the actual world of Persona as well, right? I probably would put him above Morgana in B tier. He may be a contender for A, but I think that there are some other characters in the Fan of Thieves that would fit that A tier a little bit more nicely. And then we have Junpei Iori, who, thanks to the way that P3 is structured and somewhat thanks to Junpei not having a social link, his character development is tied in very heavily with the main story. Now, of course, in Reload, you have the linked episodes, which are effectively social links that aren't confined to the restrictions of social links, but you get that in addition to Junpei's development throughout the course of the main story that has been present since the original Persona 3. And this goes for Akihiko, Ken, and Shinji as well, with whom the linked episodes' impact does definitely vary, but Junpei, I think it only really adds to his character. It does make the Chidori revival much easier and apparent to achieve, because that was a thing in FES, for anyone who might be upset about that being in Reload. I didn't get it in FES because you have to specifically push him to go visit Chidori at the hospital. I think every single time that is an option, and I definitely wasn't paying that close attention to that subplot when I played FES. But in Reload, because it is tied in with his linked episode, and the linked episodes stand out a lot more because it's a different icon on the map, it's a lot easier to be roped into doing that. Junpei's got a lot going on in P3, way more so than the other two bro characters that came after him. Primarily, his jealousy towards the protagonist. Yosuke and Ryuji are perfectly fine with playing second fiddle when they join, and that's not necessarily a slight on their character, but I do think that adding a bit of tension to an RPG party is something that makes these characters feel a lot more realistically portrayed. I mentioned earlier that the characters in P3 generally hold their cards very close to their chest until later on as they develop, and with Junpei, he initially feels incredible when he discovers that he can use Persona, but there is an inkling of jealousy towards the protagonist because of the wild card and Makoto's proficiency when it comes to fighting shadows generally. And this boils up slowly throughout the game to where during the summer months, when Junpei comes to the realization of once we defeat all these full moon shadows, I'm going to lose my powers and therefore go back to being a nobody. He doesn't like that, and that further stirs the pot when it comes to his envy towards the protagonist, because the protagonist is just kind of good at everything despite not giving a shit most of the time, or at least appearing to not give a shit. But this is something that once he meets Chidori, he begins to grow out of this, where in his meeting of Chidori and in growing that bond with her, he finds a reason to live where maybe he didn't have one prior. I forget where this comes up and if it was even mentioned in Reload, but there was something about Junpei's dad being an alcoholic and so likely being abusive, and so there is that element to his character that I think maybe adds to the inferiority in some way. As a character, he's probably used to hearing that he's going to amount to nothing, going off of my assumptions at least. And so I'm assuming his upbringing definitely did not help when it came to him really taking to something that he was very good at. Now, baseball was kind of that thing, but he ends up dropping it because he's not particularly confident in himself. Although you see throughout his Linked episode when they're going to bash the watermelon, he starts to get sentimental towards his old baseball bat and they decide not to use it, which also indicates why he swings his two-handed claymore around like a baseball bat. It's a pretty fun bit of characterization in the gameplay there. Once Chidori dies, Junpei does go into a slump for sure, because that was his reason for continuing on. But thanks to the motivation of his teammates and his own willpower, he's able to push past that. And I think also shows a lot of maturity when Chidori is revived, despite her not remembering anything about him, and despite in all likelihood them never rekindling what they once had, though I guess it is a possibility. He's just happy that she's alive, and I think that shows a tremendous amount of maturity. Sure, following that, he does end up snapping at the protagonist because he's scared about what's going to happen with Nyx and the fall and all that, which is understandable, but he does end up apologizing for that and realizing that he was taking things out on Makoto for things that aren't really actually his fault, despite Makoto's connection with Ryoji, and therefore in some sense Nyx. This is one of those characters that could easily be in the S tier. I'm just kind of looking through at what other characters might be S tier contenders to try to not make the S tier be too large. I think I'm going to give Junpei a high A and just issue a reminder that the A tier is a very strong ranking in this tier list. There's the possibility I bump him up later, but we'll just leave him there for now. So An is a character that's really grown on me over time, especially with her portrayal in Strikers, which again was due in part to her being focused on more in Strikers. So it's one of those things where I think that the parties in these games, and the main cast I guess generally, could stand to be just a little bit smaller, so that way each character can get an equal amount of limelight throughout the main games. I think this is something that P3 does really well, but one of their members is a dog, and one of their other members also dies after just a few months of being on the team. So it does end up being somewhat of a smaller pool of characters to actually focus on characterization wise, even if Koromaru is best boy. I really like An's confidence. She also has a kindness to her, similar to Yukari, which I guess is understandable in that they're both of the Lovers Arcana. I'm not super well versed when it comes to the lore implications surrounding each character's assigned Arcana. It is clear even from a surface level that it does impact the way their personalities are crafted. I'm curious what the design process is, if they design a character with a certain Arcana in mind, or if they design a character with a certain personality and then assign the Arcana afterwards. Probably the former, because they need to fill these various Arcana roles, but we've also seen them add various Arcana that aren't present in other games, so I don't know. I think An has a level-headedness to her that I really like. She does at first glance seem like the ditzy blonde, but she's actually a lot smarter than that, and while she's not as analytical and logical as some characters that get added to the Phantom Thieves later on, I think that her compassion and confidence, at least following the Kamoshida arc, or once she awakens to her persona basically, is really admirable, and I really like An as a character quite a bit. And this extends into Strikers with her dealing with Alice and all of that, and I feel like her portrayal in Strikers adds to my perception of her as a character. So An is definitely going to go in A tier. I might like her more than Yukari, but it's kind of close. I'm going to put her just between Junpei and Yukari. Chie. I like Chie in P4G. However, it's very clear that this character gets done dirty in the spin-offs. Now, the only spin-off I've played with Chie in it is Arena Ultimax, but she is one of the characters that is the most flanderized with her obsession with meat, and that's pretty much it, I guess. She does bring it up a few times in P4G, some of which are when she gives you that meat gum, but that might be a nighttime event, so maybe that was added in Golden. Maybe that wasn't in the original P4, since going out at night wasn't a thing in the vanilla version. I don't count it too much against her in the original game, but she's definitely a character that I think is pretty whatever in Arena Ultimax. I'm not really going to factor that in so much here. It's pretty easy to just kind of brush that aside for the sake of talking about her portrayal in P4G. So when Chie isn't butting heads with Yosuke, which can be enjoyable enjoyable in its own right. She is very determined, but maybe not so sure of herself. There's definitely an insecurity there, especially early on when it comes to her comparison to Yukiko, who is kind of the prim and proper, more effeminate female character compared to Chie's more tomboyishness. But she does grow to overcome that insecurity. I do think that Chie maintains relevancy throughout the main campaign. She is a little bit on the stubborn side, so she does try to keep up and stay in the conversation as more and more characters get added. I'm like a little bit lukewarm on her, but I like her about the same as Yosuke, TBH. Yusuke, I do enjoy as a character. He's definitely very quirky and doesn't really fit into any particular box, which is what makes him such a lovable character in some sense. And I do actually relate to Yusuke somewhat from the artistic side of things, in being a musician for most of my life. There definitely is a relatability there in maintaining inspiration, feeling like you're not good enough at times, and wanting to hone your craft to the best of your ability. But as a character, I feel like he tends to get lost in the weeds when it comes to P5's overarching narrative. And I think as a character that is hurt by the way that P4 and P5 handle its characters, in that much of their development and characterization is relegated to the social links, which you may not pace out throughout the duration of the game, and therefore kind of interact with them almost never directly, just kind of depending on whose S-links or confidants in this case that you focus on. Like, I enjoy Yusuke as a character, but I can't say I ever felt particularly strongly about him either. The moments that I like with him, I like quite a bit. I think it's partially because he's such a reserved character that in these big group moments, maybe he will have a one-liner here and there to contribute his 2 cents, but he largely is just kind of there, aside from the Madarame arc, which I think does showcase the strength of his character, or at least the potential strength of his character. But I just don't feel that throughout the duration of P5, and it does come back somewhat in Strikers with the second jail in that game, but I can't justify putting him any higher than B. I'd probably put him with his other Phantom Thief brethren, but just kind of on the lower end of these guys. Let's bounce back to P3. We have Akihiko, who formerly I would have said is my favorite character in P3. He would definitely cut my top 5. He's not quite number 1 for me, but I do like his character a lot. I find his aloofness to be entertaining. I also find his determination admirable. Add to that how many great character moments he has throughout the course of P3's events, thanks to being an OG member of C's, therefore his connection to Mitsuru and Shinji and Ken. So whether it's him being overzealous to fight shadows when interacting with Mitsuru, his determination when it comes to trying to get Shinji to rejoin C's, or him serving as somewhat of a mentor figure for Ken, I really enjoy pretty much every scene that Akihiko is a focus of. And that determination and focus actually does result in him losing sight of what was right in front of him, which was one of his closest friends being Shinji, and not really appreciating or acknowledging that it may be temporary. He ends up taking that relationship for granted in some sense, because he's so hung up on putting a stop to the Dark Hour. While Shinji's death does further strengthen that determination, it is with the realization that moping around and feeling sorry for himself for making that mistake of being too focused on the task at hand is gonna get him nowhere, and so he has to press on. Something that I somewhat mentioned with Junpei, but is relevant to most of C's, is that their proficiencies with the various weapons actually make sense, instead of being something that I guess is endowed in them via their persona, probably, when it comes to P4 and 5. So you can kind of suspend your disbelief for that, I suppose. But in P3, Yukari's on the archery team, Akihiko's the captain of the boxing team. Mitsuru, no doubt, takes up fencing among her other very posh hobbies. Aigis is literally designed to kill shadows, and then Ken's been training for his own reasons, which we'll get into later. And then Shinji's just a beast of a man, so I am not surprised that he's able to just wail on shadows with a giant battle axe or stop sign or whatever. Yeah, I really like Akihiko as a character, and of course his awakening scene when he is mourning over Shinji's death and then makes the choice to be even more determined for Shinji's sake in addition to his sister's sake. Now his linked episode, I do think gives some insight into his past at the orphanage, but it tends to more so focus on these thugs that keep turning up and causing trouble, and so he's having to kind of strike that balance of, do I want to pick a fight with these guys and risk getting in trouble even if it isn't self-defense? But then in the end you end up beating up all the thugs together and then not getting punished for it because Kurosawa is willing to look the other way. Akihiko seems like the type of character where he bonds very heavily with people through fighting, which is understandable with him being a boxer as well as his goings on with C's. So I think that makes him more willing to open up to Makoto as far as his past. I just really enjoy whenever Akihiko's on screen. I do think that Junpei probably has a stronger overall arc, although both arcs are very strong, but I'm I'm gonna give Akihiko the S tier. Yukiko. I wouldn't say I dislike Yukiko, but I'm very lukewarm on her. She's fantastic in combat, but we're not factoring that in. It's really unclear to me what they were actually going for with her, because she's got this stern academic prim and proper side, but then she also has like the laughing fits, which are, I guess, intended to show that she is able to lighten up, but she's always laughing at either just LOL random stuff or something darker. Because of the lol random stuff that she laughs at, I think it kind of diminishes the potential impact of her laughing at more dark humor. I think doubling down on her sternness and taste for dark humor and almost making her kind of like a closet goth in a sense maybe would have been a better angle. She does get death magic, at least in Golden, even if her focus is fire, but it's just a weird combination of character traits, and I'm not super wild about her. She's one of those characters that loses plot relevance pretty heavily, aside from the fact that you rescued her at the beginning. That's another thing that I like about C's a lot too, is that every character has a reason to be there, or at least grows to have a reason to be there. Whereas with the investigation team in Phantom Thieves, because the game's plot structure is so formulaic in that the next party member is in trouble, and so we gotta go save them or turn them to our side or whatever it is, and it kind of just does that formula over and over and over again, it makes me less convinced as to why they stick around, except for maybe like a trauma bonding kind of thing, which I do kind of buy in a sense, especially because they have personas. So like early on, it makes sense why Yukiko is needed, because they just need more manpower. And I guess in P4 specifically, the implication is that the other members are also infiltrating the TV world at the same time, whereas in P3, your reserve units are actually resting, so that way they have the energy to climb Tartarus with you when you come back to pick them up. And I think the Phantom Thieves are the same way, but I'm not recalling exactly. I wouldn't say I dislike her, so she's not going to go in the D tier, but definitely a character that I'm very meh on. Although I do find her situation sympathetic in that she is torn whether she wants to take over the family business or go out on her own and do her own thing. And she ultimately comes to the realization of just staying and taking over the family business. I think Yukiko has the potential to be a much more compelling character, if not at least distinct in some way. She's ultimately the most forgettable character that I've talked about thus far, aside from the fact that she joins very early and is one of the best party members combat-wise in P4 thanks to her access to all the healing spells. And Makoto Nijima. I didn't realize how divisive this character was, so I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. I can understand being off-put by this character in her initial introduction, especially with maybe not knowing if she's going to join the Phantom Thieves. As someone who had played P4 previously, and I guess being somewhat familiar with P5 prior to playing it, I knew she was going to join up, so I figured there would be some kind of arc for her, and therefore that she wouldn't stay the exact same way as she is when she's introduced. So maybe that's a contributing factor towards me liking this character. I find the disdain towards her very weird. I don't think that she is like the greatest character ever, let alone even on this tier list, but I think that her perception on a first impression is perhaps impacting and limiting a lot of people's ability to see her character growth, which again is somewhat limited because of how P4 and P5 handle their character growth in the main plot, but it is there. She's a very sheltered, academically focused girl who, through being proficient at her studies and student body president and all that, gains the trust of primarily the principal in this case, who is an actual shithead and not in an enjoyable way, but she also has the expectations placed on her by her older sister, and with both of her parents being gone, I can see why she feels so isolated and views there as being not any other choice but to comply with spying on the Phantom Thieves on behalf of the principal and his suspicions of them. However, on her discovery of the true nature of the Phantom Thieves and what they're doing, she ends up realizing pretty quickly that the power that they have and that she eventually gains can be used to do legitimate good for not only their local community, but for the entire country as the game escalates towards with Shido and whatnot, but primarily with stopping Kanashiro, who's, you know, this kind of, I guess, like Yakuza drug dealer, something or other. I'm trying to remember, I think that is also a big thing that Makoto's trying to look into to begin with. It's just that the Phantom Thieves act very suspiciously and so maybe seem like they're involved with the drug dealing kind of shenanigans that are going on. But upon her joining the team, I almost entirely was able to forgive her narkishness, for lack of a better term, towards the Phantom Thieves. And I don't think they all earn her trust immediately either. Although, as I mentioned with Morgana, once Makoto joins, she's able to deduce a lot of things about the metaverse and what they're dealing with here, and ends up being kind of the brains behind the operation, since Morgana has kind of spilled all of the information that he really knows, since he's kind of got that amnesia factor going on. I can also see why Makoto's prevalence can maybe be off-putting to some people. I blame this more so on the protagonists being silent, because I think a lot of her lines and a lot of her deductions that the protagonist often reinforces would have been outright stated by the protagonist protagonist if they actually had a speaking role and were more their own character. So Makoto and Morgana, as I had mentioned, are somewhat surrogates for the protagonists' speaking roles in many cases. And so once we get to Strikers, Makoto, being a pretty reserved character personality-wise, at least when she's not donning her Phantom Thief costume, ends up just not being super noteworthy in that game. But I feel like that must have been done to make up for and try to balance out her potential overprevalence in the original game. Although even despite all that I've said thus far, the fact that Sai is so heavily involved with the main story influences Makoto's involvement in the main story and helps her maintain relevancy, since Sai's palace is very late on in the game as well. Also, when it comes to the main cast, I know a lot of people look at Makoto's confidant and say, you know, it's garbage, and I guess therefore is a reason to dislike the character or something. But even though I've said that P4 and P5 characters tend to have much of their character development present in their confidant or social link, when one of these characters has somewhat of a forgettable S-link or confidant, I don't really necessarily hold it against them because I'm judging the character as a whole and not just the confidant or social link. I do find the pressure that's put on her somewhat relatable, as I think a lot of people could probably relate to someone who has a lot of pressure put on them to get straight A's or perform well in extracurriculars, etc., right? And while it's definitely much more severe in her case than what I had to deal with growing up, it is something that I'm very aware of and am sympathetic towards. And it's really one of those things where if she didn't have so much plot relevance, I feel like she would maybe be a little on the forgettable side. But because of said plot relevance, and because I think that her situation and character growth are sympathetic in some ways, I am going to throw Makoto in the A tier, kind of on the lower end. I think that her portrayal in Strikers kind of showed me that it was mainly plot relevancy that was keeping her in such high regard for me, whereas if you kind of strip some of that away, she's not maybe as remarkable as a character. But I do like Makoto quite a bit. I mean, A tier is still pretty high praise. Now, Mitsuru is a character that I've not felt as strongly towards as a lot of other people. I've been racking my brain for years at this point as to why this is. She definitely has a very strong and commanding personality. You would think that she was the leader, if not for the MC being the leader, of course. Because Mitsuru is related to the Kirijo group, she has huge plot relevancy, and she knows way more than the other characters about what is actually going on, even if she is still kept in the dark about a lot of it as well. And so she is, as a teenager still, having to deal with the guilt of what her grandfather has done, in addition to being kind of the middleman communication-wise between her father and the rest of Seas as far as their directive and what exactly her involvement is in this, which Yukari, as I mentioned before, takes skepticism towards, understandably so. But Mitsuru ends up admitting fault to withholding information, and her father even scolds her about it when they go to Yakushima. It is understandable in her case that it's a very delicate operation, especially when it comes to giving this information to Yukari. I think it is kind of unfair for her father to put that on her, although he's busy, I guess, with other stuff. And then, of course, later on in the game, dealing with her father's death, in addition to all the traumas previously, like Shinjiro dying and the feeling of betrayal from when Ikutsuki shows his true nature, etc., etc. And then her social link is very endearing because her family is very wealthy. She had never eaten a hamburger before, and etc., etc. You know how it goes. I do like the way that she tells off her fiance eventually because of her feelings towards the protagonist, whether they be romantic or platonic. I ended up getting the romantic version, and so it was hard to turn her down. I'm actually glad that they give you the option to turn down girls in Reload, because I've said several times in the past that I'm not really here for the dating side of things. I could really take or leave it. Mitsuru I do like as a character, and she's got a lot more going for her than a lot of the characters in B. I'm definitely gonna have to give her the A tier, probably above Makoto at this point, but I actually kind of think I like Yukari more. But it's also one of those things where I don't want to sweat the rankings within the tiers too much, because then we'll be here all day. Kanji is easily my favorite of the P4 cast. He's got kind of the brashness of Ryuji, but also has a much more sensitive side, and I think that deals with something that is somewhat relatable to probably most of us. Not that most people who play video games or Persona are into knitting or whatever, but if you're old enough to remember when playing video games or certain kinds of video games was not the cool thing to be doing necessarily, and so feeling like you were weird because you weren't into sports or cars or whatever it might be, and you might be into video games and those things as well. I know it was something that I didn't feel super confident in speaking on when I was growing up, mostly because my experience with video games wasn't incredibly well-rounded. It was almost exclusively on the Nintendo side of things for many years, which I'm actually grateful for now because of how strong and long-lasting that legacy is. But back when I was, you know, around Kanji's age, I wasn't really speaking to very many people about video games and my passion for them and stuff like that, which I can kind of see in his character, being scared of not being seen as as a man because he's into knitting and whatever else he's into. And so he kind of puts on a front of being tougher than he actually is. But that is something that the phrase fake it till you make it, while cliche, definitely has some truth to it in that Kanji is legitimately a tough guy. But it's because he was putting on that act for so long that it eventually did become genuinely a part of his personality. But then there are times where that more sensitive side comes out, and I find that really endearing. Like when he makes the doll for the kid and then the kid comes back and he's like, hey, can you make me another one for my sibling or whatever? In addition to Kanji being my favorite character in the form of comic relief in P4, which is something that I didn't give P4 a lot of credit for, that game legitimately, both on my first playthrough and second playthrough, made me laugh out loud quite a few times actually. And that can't quite be said to the same extent for P3, despite that being my favorite one. P3 plays things a lot more serious much of the time, which I think is to that game's benefit, but I do think that the humor in P4 is something that I wasn't as vocal about appreciating in my initial discussion video. And it's thanks in large part to Kanji. So Kanji is going to be the first P4 character to crack the S tier. Futaba. There's definitely moments with Futaba's character that could be seen as cringy because of her being a shut-in during a very particular span of time. And so therefore, a lot of the lingo that she uses is very indicative of said time period. And so while that is something that could potentially not age super well as far as relevancy is concerned, I do think that it is a unique kind of time capsule for that period that she was terminally online for. And much of her character arc is kind of getting used to integrating into society more formally. I very much view Futaba as being a younger sister kind of character. To me, she will always be the baby sister to Ren. And so you have this kind of oddball family of Sojiro, Futaba, and Ren. And I really like that dynamic a lot. And I think that when Futaba isn't trying to act like whatever anime hackers she may be familiar with or whatever, when she is genuinely just being a normal person, I enjoy her presence. And there is always kind of an ever-present quirkiness to her, even when she's not saying kek and stuff like that out loud, that I find endearing. Like how she calls Sojiro Sojiro instead of dad or whatever, and just kind of her enthusiasm when it comes to going out and doing stuff as a family once she is able to get over her trauma. I actually found her arc regarding her palace and whatnot to be one of the stronger moments in P5 because it was a lot more personal and focused as opposed to being too grand for its own good. It's one of those things similar to Morgana where I think the character is written in a way that, while it may be cringy on the surface, and I would definitely agree with that at times, it's kind of just in her character to be that way. People who act in a way that could be deemed cringe exist. And so similar to also what I said about Yosuke, it's like, should these character flaws never be written into characters for the sake of quote unquote likability and surface level likability of that, and you end up with characters that are super bland? I kind of prefer this to her just being a generic hacker type of character. I would definitely give her the B tier. I do like her character. I would hesitate to put her in C just because I think those emotional moments do a lot for me with this character. And that kind of family dynamic that I mentioned as well. Maybe just above Yusuke, somewhere around here. All right, next we have Fuuka. I guess we're gonna do the three navigators back to back. Fuuka I quite like as a character. Very sweet, soft-spoken, nerdy, very techy. Not to the extent of Futaba, but she's kind of bookish, right? And Fuuka's arc is very much that of overcoming insecurity, which I think is something most people can relate to. Because even though Fuuka is a hugely integral member of SEES, she still feels like she doesn't contribute much because she's not actively fighting up in Tartarus. But without her, SEES would have no fucking clue what they're doing when it comes to fighting shadows. And I guess, yeah, you could test weaknesses like you were doing prior to her recruitment. I think Reload in particular shows just how important she is through gameplay. But we are talking about characterization here and not gameplay utility. I just want to say that it strengthens the perceivable insecurity that she has regarding her usefulness. And of course, she kind of has a parental pressure thing going on, although you don't see it as directly because she is living in the dorm. She's a really sweet character, and I always enjoy character moments with her. I wouldn't say that she is one of my favorite members of SEES or a major standout, but when I did her social link, particularly in Reload, I enjoyed it. She's just a very pleasant character to be around. I kind of feel like putting her in B because I don't know if I feel as strongly towards her as the A tiers, but I also feel like I enjoy her company more than a lot of the B tiers. It pains me to even be considering putting Fuuka in B tier. B tier is still on the positive side, and so I don't want this to reflect poorly, but I do kind of want to put her maybe above Morgana. I think high B for Fuuka is probably accurate to how I feel about her. Rise, the last navigator to talk about. Rise has some depth to her character that may not be apparent at first glance. Her being torn between remaining in the idol industry or just enjoying being a small town girl living in a lonely world. But no, seriously, I find her plight to be sympathetic. However, I do think that her simping towards the protagonist, which I know that some of it is an act, I could see some of that being a defense mechanism of some kind, maybe. It is something that gets a little bit grating, and I much prefer when Rise is being her true self, which obviously that's what the game is about primarily. And so when she's showcasing that, I really like Rise as a character quite a bit, maybe even A tier worthy, and maybe she is A tier worthy, just kind of generally. I would maybe say the pros of Rise do outweigh the cons, and so I do kind of want to give her A tier, maybe just above Makoto. Haru. So the thing with Haru, she does join very late, as a lot of people have said, although given her particular personality and what we do get from her, I don't know that her being present earlier in the story would have done much more for me personally. A very sweet and caring character for sure, which I do like, and when she is a little bit more down about the situation, I find her very sympathetic. And then you do have her talking about killing shadows and whatever in a very cutesy way. In Strikers, for instance, she's got some more focus in Strikers because of her relationship to the third jail scenario. And so I think as a character and a personality, I do like Haru. Her plot relevance quickly fades. I don't think that her arc is handled particularly well. For one, because it starts with the Morgana Ryuji fallout kind of stuff, and the way her dad's death is handled is not great either. More on that in my previous P5R video. I just think the cast of P5 is too big, and so after the Okumura arc, she tends to kind of get thrown by the wayside, sort of like Yusuke. I did like her confidant quite a bit though. Probably put her like high B maybe. And before we get into the final 12 of the main cast, let's knock out some Velvet attendants real quick. The Velvet characters are kind of like bonus. There's no other tier list that would really make sense for me to put these guys in. Certainly not antagonists, and then the S-Link one has plenty of characters already. I'm gonna be honest, dude, Igor is iconic to the series in general, but I'm kind of like whatever about him because he's just not given much of a character. I enjoy his presence in a weird way. I would miss Igor if he didn't show up in Persona 6, for instance, but as a character, I feel like he's gotta go in C by default. There's just not a whole lot to him. Elizabeth is the GOAT of the Velvet attendants, bar none. I don't really feel like I have to explain much, but there's something about her personality and her curiosity about the world that I really buy and find entertaining. She is the source of some of the more funny moments in P3, generally speaking. There is also something kind of tender about her relationship with the protagonist as well, something genuine there that I don't quite feel with the other Velvet attendants, which we'll get into, but Elizabeth is gonna go right by Dorkun up there. Margaret, I think, is kind of boring. I get that she's supposed to be kind of the stern and calculating one to complement Elizabeth's quirkiness. I just don't really care about Margaret much. I always forget about Margaret's social link because it is locked behind doing the fusions. And see, Elizabeth doesn't have an S-Link specifically, but I just found them to be less demanding. I just never really feel compelled to pursue Margaret's social link. I think I even forgot to mention previously that it is one that I didn't max on my most recent P4G replay. Design alone will carry her to the top of C, but I've got to give her a C. She's kind of whatever. I'm gonna be honest, I kind of find the twins to be sort of annoying. It's something that I've kind of realized as I've reflected on things and, you know, replayed P4, where Margaret is not super interesting, but she's not super intrusive either. The twins are prevalent enough to where you can't really ignore them, like with Margaret. Caroline, isn't she the one on the right? She's a little bit more stern, and so I guess I like that a little bit more than Justine, who's just kind of very milquetoast. Justine is just kind of very forgettable, and eventually it's revealed that they're both actually Lavenza, and then Lavenza doesn't really show that Caroline side of herself at all, so I don't really know what to make of that. I just don't really care for these guys that much. It is something that when I think about replaying P5R, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna have to deal with these two prior to Lavenza, and then Lavenza is just kind of boring. So maybe Lavenza here, and then Justine probably below Lavenza, maybe below Yukiko, and then Caroline, a stronger personality, but I don't really like her that much either. It's just kind of grating to me, but definitely more interesting. I'd probably put her above Lavenza, I guess. And then Jose is also hard to glean from, like he's weird robot child who drinks flowers. I don't know what to glean from him. I feel like this is not the last we've seen of him. Either he'll be a Velvet attendant later on or something, I would imagine. But then again, this is Persona we're talking about, where characters will show up in spin-offs, for instance, and then never again. So yeah, probably C, I guess. Might seem weird putting all the Velvet attendants in C, but again, it's just kind of like a meh. Like I don't really feel much of anything towards most of these characters. And then Yukiko is there. It's so weird. They totally nailed it with Elizabeth. Even though I played P4 before P3, I just don't really connect much with the other Velvet attendants like at all. So we got Goro Akechi, who I know is handled very differently in P5 Vanilla. I only played maybe the first half of P5 Vanilla, maybe not even. And so most of my experience with Akechi was in Royal. I did consider consider putting Akechi in the antagonist tier list, and I guess I could also throw him in there, but I don't think there are any other characters that are overlapping, so I'm just gonna rank him here. Because unlike a lot of the other antagonists, I really like Akechi a lot as a character, in addition to his function as an antagonist and rival towards Ren, especially in the Royal Semester. I do think that he's a little bit too similar to Adachi in his mentality. It's hard for me to hold that against him as an individual because I think he's generally executed pretty well in Royal, in that you're building up his confidant just like any other and getting to know him. Later on, he reveals that he actually hates you after a certain point in the story. I think he hates you because you were actually able to match him in intellect and combat prowess and pretty much everything, apparently, even though Ren isn't characterized super thoroughly in P5. It kind of is that thing of like Ren has been forming these bonds with the Phantom Thieves, and then Akechi is kind of this loner who views that as being a weakness, thanks in part to Shido being his dad, so that's obviously not a good thing. In addition to that, his portrayal in Royal is just so good, like where he's just unabashedly completely himself, as opposed to putting on a facade. I like that version of Akechi. Like, he's very cynical, but still calculating and quick-witted in the same way, but he's just like a lot colder about it, as opposed to putting on this warmer, fake smile. And his showtime with Ren is like so good. When I first discovered that that was a thing, that was so cool. I like Akechi a lot. Definitely my favorite character in Persona 5 Royal. I would put him probably even above Akihiko, maybe? Hard to say, but he's definitely S tier for sure. Let's do Teddie first. On paper, I should absolutely despise Teddie. For every moment that I do find him legitimately entertaining, there is another moment where I find him equally irritating. I do think something is lost in translation with him being called Teddie instead of just being called Kuma or Bear. I know that the localizers tried to accommodate for this by giving him straight up bear puns, but I don't think it works as well without his name being Bear in a literal sense. Because in the Japanese, you can actually hear him emphasize the Kuma part of certain words, or changing certain words to have the Kuma prefix where maybe they wouldn't otherwise. And this is coming from someone who doesn't speak Japanese at all, but I can understand certain words and certain turns of phrase at times. And you can hear him really lean into those Kuma, whatever he's saying, similar to the, you know, unbearable or whatever. And this is one of those characters that in the dub I just can't stand, but in Japanese, even though he's a little whinier sounding, for whatever reason it doesn't bother me as much. I do feel like I'm probably gonna have to give him the C tier. I wouldn't say I'm on him. It is more like I like him in one moment and then I find him annoying the next. And that is how the characters are also finding him. So similar to what I've said about Futaba and Morgana, you could maybe make the same case for Teddie in that he is annoying in universe. That kind of thing doesn't always translate well to the audience watching from beyond the screen. And of course you can have an annoying character who does grow from that. And Teddie does grow as a character. I mean, literally he does grow a person, like a human body inside of him. So I give him C. It is less of a lukewarm and it is more of like a pros and cons meeting each other in the middle, putting him in that sort of realm of meh, even if that's not what I would describe my feelings towards him as being. And then we have Aigis, who is probably my favorite P3 character, understandably, considering her huge plot relevance when it comes to her relationship to the main character, her being a product of the Kirijo group. If you've played P3, I think you can clearly see why Aigis is among my favorite characters. While the whole robot learning to become more human thing is not uncommon, it's done so well here that I have to give her kudos as a character. Her social link is very enjoyable, shows a lot of different facets of what goes into the human experience in different facets. In addition to that through line throughout the story, despite her being an anti-shadow weapon that has some kind of human personality because you need that to be able to summon a persona, the humanity in her does become more apparent throughout the course of the game until eventually she does produce actual tears after the protagonist makes it out alive from fighting Nyx. And then that rooftop scene too, talking to the protagonist about how much her time with him and the rest of C's has meant to her and how much she's grown from that. It's hard for me not to put Aigis at like the very top. Ranking the S tiers is too difficult for me, so I'm not gonna really try to do that. Easy S tier, hard to put into words. Now we have Kasumi / Sumire. The more I've thought about it, the more I do think that her being an addition to Royal is apparent. It never really bothered me that much, aside from maybe the very beginning of the game. I think it would have been cool maybe if they did it in a way where she didn't show up quite yet at the beginning of the game or something, but maybe if you pursue her confidant, then when that scene is reprised, she does show up. Is she shoehorned in certain cases? Yes, but do I think that it is justified by the third semester content? Also yes. I think the third semester content in Royal provides some of the best parts of Royal, being a character we'll talk about in a following tier list. Akechi's portrayal, of course, and Kasumi in this case also, although there are certain elements to the third semester that I don't think are handled that well generally, but that's more from kind of a plot angle as opposed to a character one. And so with this character, whom I am always torn as to whether I want to call her Sumire or Kasumi, but she kind of takes on the personality of her her dead sister, who was tragically killed, who was kind of the perfect one, so to speak. Whereas Sumire, which is her actual name, was kind of the one who was never quite as good. Because she does take on the name of her sister, people expect her to be perfect at her gymnast stuff and academics and whatnot, and she's just not that because she's not actually the twin who was good at that stuff. The more interesting facets to her character don't get revealed really until the third semester. I find her backstory to be incredibly tragic and very sympathetic. Of course, there is some magic kinds of stuff going on because of how Maruki made her truly believe that she was her sister to some effect, or at least able to capture the personality of her sister in a convincing way. That must have been extremely heartbreaking for her parents and teachers and whatnot who knew her to see that, because they must have known that she was doing this as a response to the trauma in some way, which just adds to the tragedy, I think. I have softened on her a bit compared to how I felt just coming off of Royal, and also just ranking the P5 characters specifically. She's gonna go in the A tier as one of the stronger characters among the Phantom Thieves. I'd probably put her just above Rise, maybe. Now we have Koromaru, and look, Koromaru's a dog, and so it's not exactly fair to the rest of the tier list. Realistically speaking, I'm gonna give him honorary A tier for being a good boy. There were moments in his Linked episode that, while not necessarily character moments for him specifically, because he is a dog, granted much more expressive and communicative than your average dog, for the sake of being fiction, and for simplicity's sake, I guess, when it comes to watching TV with him and whatever. But anyway, there were moments in his Linked episode that got me feeling kind of emotional because I knew what was gonna happen at the end of the game, particularly when it was like, hey, you want to come with me, boy, when I graduate, instead of staying at the dorm with the ever-cycling residents. Knowing that Makoto Yuki wasn't going to be able to do that for Koro is heartbreaking. Koro does gravitate towards Ken, of course, following the events of P3. I also like that Koromaru joins C's already having his second theurgy, and therefore, to be assumed, second-tier persona. So now we have Naoto, who, contrary to most of these characters, is actually portrayed maybe in a way that I prefer in Arena Ultimax compared to Golden. I don't think there's any other character on this list that I could say the same for. In P4G, we only ever really hear about her detective goings-on secondhand. And yeah, you do kind of solve a mystery in her social link. And yeah, she is pretty integral in deducing certain things about the overarching mystery in the main story of P4G. But there's something about seeing her actually interact with adults regarding the events of Persona 4 Arena, less so the Ultimax story. I kind of wish we got more of that in P4G, instead of just kind of hearing about it secondhand. And yeah, I guess Adachi and Dojima both speak skeptically about Naoto before we even really know who she is. Like, she may have been on screen, but I don't know that we know quite to the extent that she's involved or whatever. I think Naoto has even more potential than what she was given in P4G, despite being one of the stronger characters in P4G anyway. Probably gonna give Naoto A tier. It is interesting how beloved Naoto is compared to Makoto when they do sort of serve similar roles. It's just Naoto actually joins the investigation team a lot later, relative to when Makoto joins the Phantom Thieves. But anyway, I kind of think she's somewhat of a lower A tier for me, but I do like her quite a bit, and I do think that her portrayal in Arena has had me look at her character in a more positive light than if we were just basing it off of Golden. I think that's a fair placement. I could maybe be convinced to place her higher, but within the tiers, it is kind of a mixed bag. So next we have Sophia. Kind of a similar arc to Aigis, but also different in some ways. She is a lot more childlike than Aigis, both in appearance and in the way that she understands the world, which makes sense because while Aigis was dormant for a while, she was active previously, whereas Sophia kind of becomes active really for the first time in this form, at least, when Ren and Ryuji and Morgana, I think, is there too, maybe, when they find her underneath the first jail in the game. I'm trying to remember, she's like the scrapped prototype of the AI that the main antagonist of P5S was developing, whom I'll keep ambiguous, I guess, until I do the antagonist tier list, even though I would assume you know who it is if you're here, but whatever. She's kind of like a child character, even though she is an AI that is not annoying in any way. There's something about the way that she inquires about humanity at the end of each arc that I find very endearing, and then I like the way that Ren kind of instructs her in these various facets of the human heart, so she is able to eventually develop an actual persona instead of having somewhat of a stand-in or whatever she had initially. I find that quite powerful. I like Sophia. I think that she added something very positive to the Striker's experience. So I'm going to go ahead and throw her in the A tier. Maybe above Rise or something. Maybe above Yoshizawa. It's really hard to actually place these, realistically speaking. So now we have Ken, whom in the original P3, or I guess Fess in my particular case, I didn't feel super strongly about him. Although I think in Reload, the bonding that you're able to do in the linked episode helped me appreciate his character more. I can't tell if his portrayal in the main story was changed much, or by how much, if any. I do think that Shinji's death scene hit even harder than the original, and so that is something that does add to Ken's character because of how intimately tied in with Shinjiro he is. He ultimately is the cause of that scene going sideways, which there's no way that it wasn't going to because of what he was trying to do. And because he is a literal child, I don't blame him for having this ambitious plan to kill Shinji for killing Ken's mom. And of course Shinji knows that he's gonna die anyway, so he's kind of like, whatever, just do it, but just know that it's not gonna make you feel fulfilled. And even though Ken doesn't kill Shinji, once Shinji is dead, he does realize, I think, in the aftermath that revenge wasn't going to solve his issue, and that does show his strength of character despite being so young and kind of being thrust into this situation. I do like the moments where Ken is more unapologetically a kid, like when he gets excited about the Featherman show that shows up on TV when you're eating ramen with him, or when he tells you his hamster's name is Hamburger and he's kind of embarrassed about it. It's cute. He's a young kid and he should be able to live that life without having to worry about all of the things that he's thrust into in the events of P3. I think in the Arena Ultimax story specifically, since he's not in the original arena, I think his little arc there and that extension of him being able to live a normal life is really heartwarming, and I really liked that aspect. That was the start of my appreciation towards Ken's character, and then playing through the P3 story again with these added linked episodes made me quite like Ken as a character. If Fuuka's going to be in B tier, which I think is a little silly to put Fuuka below Koromaru because Fuuka has more going on, I think to try to balance things out a little bit, I am going to give Ken the B tier. Yeah, because I wouldn't say that I like super strongly like him as a character, but I do like Ken as a character. Definitely more so now, maybe below Fuuka though. Oh, now we have Marie. The thing about Marie is I'm not a fan of her implementation into Persona 4's story. Although if we look at her as a character in a vacuum, I don't absolutely hate her, but I also don't really like her that much either. Very stereotypically tsundere. The poetry stuff is kind of cringy in my opinion. Even if you ignore her social link, I think that stuff is mandatory, and so it's just one of those things where I find Marie's presence just generally and the plot implications and whatnot in Golden to be a detractor and something that I would prefer to not have to deal with. When I first played P4G, I didn't know that Marie was an addition to Golden, but her design stuck out so much to me compared to the rest of the cast and the other character designs that were present in the original P4 that I wasn't surprised when I found out she was an addition. I was like, oh, that actually makes sense, because like, how could she not be? Yeah, she's probably the only character on this list that I actually feel some sort of distaste towards, so I am going to give her the bottom tier pretty easily. And now we're down to the final three very strong characters actually. First and foremost, we have Zenkichi, who is hugely integral to Striker's narrative. I think Striker's not being beholden to the typical Persona, or well, I guess Hashino Persona structure, which is the typical structure at this point, is to his benefit as a character, because he's able to be treated more so like your average P3 character, instead of relegating a lot of his growth and whatnot to a social link or confidant or whatever. Not only is it very cool to have an adult Persona user for the first time since Eternal Punishment, while that is cool, it's not reason alone as to why I really love Zenkichi as a character, because I think a lot of these characters on this list have a lot of depth and maturity to them despite not being adults. But Zenkichi, it feels like doing him a disservice to boil it down like this, but it is kind of like him being torn between his responsibility as a police officer of some kind, even though he's working for, I think, some kind of special division in there. I'd have to replay Strikers to get all the details, but he's kind of torn between that and between genuinely wanting to help these kids clear their names, because while they do know more about the metaverse than they lead on at first, he has a hunch that they're not actually the culprits behind the weird brainwashing stuff that's going on with the jails and Emma and all that stuff. His eventual awakening scene when his daughter ends up being manipulated into being a jail warden is a very powerful scene, and he realizes in that moment that he has not been a good father figure because he's been away and focused on work too much. It's just really hard to verbalize why Zenkichi is among my favorite characters on this list, but he's probably my favorite character in the P5 area of things, period. I mean, Akechi is definitely up there as well, of course, but I'd probably give Zenkichi the leg up on Akechi. Definitely top 10. Last two, we've got Shinjiro Aragaki. Dude's fucking cool, man. I think his linked episode adds some good character moments and fleshes out his past with C's in some sense. I do wish we got more of that, but I almost feel like leaving us wanting more is part of the tragedy of his death, because he kind of takes the stance of, I'm gonna die anyway because I can't control my persona, and so I'm taking these suppressants that are killing him basically. And I am very curious as to why he is the only member of C's who seems to be more Strega Shinji-esque in his lack of control over his persona. I'm wondering what the deal is with that. Maybe it's something better left unexplored, but it's one of those mysterious things that I'm just curious about. Like, why does he lack control over his persona where Akihiko and Mitsuru don't? I think some of the mystery and ambiguity behind his past is to his benefit, as it is in a lot of cases in storytelling generally. It's another character where it's very hard to verbalize what exactly I love about him, especially because I'm 3 hours into recording this, so I'm kind of losing focus a little bit. But in the original game, or FES, I didn't feel as strongly about Shinji. Yeah, his death still hit hard there, and it did a lot for Akihiko's character, but in Reload, I legitimately really love Shinji as a character, period. Something that I had expounded on kind of sporadically in responding to a comment on my Persona 3 Reload discussion video, which you guys should check out as well, especially if you're this deep into this video. But despite going against Shinji's wishes as far as pushing his re-enrollment into school on him, through that he realizes that even if he is going to die anyway, for the sake of the promise that he made to graduate with Mitsuru and Akihiko, he might as well agree to re-enroll, even if he doesn't really want to, because it kind of shows him how valuable his life is, even if he might not have much left. And then it's cut even shorter because he's murdered by Takeya. That just kind of adds to the tragedy. And then you and Mitsuru find that slip in his desk that he was going to re-enroll, and I think that's kind of enough for Mitsuru to feel more at ease. Although I do wish that there was even more between him and Mitsuru, but I think that Mitsuru, similar to Akihiko, kind of took Shinji's presence for granted and expected that he would be around longer than he was. And also Mitsuru, more so than a lot of P3 characters, keeps her cards very close to the vest, so I think it's also understandable why we don't see her break down over it, but it still is a very heavy and emotional moment that I really liked. So Shinji, I'm going to put next to his partner in crime, Akihiko. Above or below, I don't think it really matters. This is more or less top 10. I could go ahead and bump Junpei up. Let's go ahead and throw Ryuji up in the A tier as well. I kind of want to move some things around a little bit. Ryuji, maybe here or something. The main positive thing that came out of Arena and Arena Ultimax is Labrys. That is like the only reason why I feel it necessary to acknowledge that game in any meaningful capacity, because a lot of other elements to it I could either take or leave or just don't like straight up. But yeah, Labrys's arc gives more insight into Aigis as a character and what they had to deal with, and maybe by the time Aigis was made, she wasn't put through these same rigorous tests, which explains why Aigis doesn't go absolutely ballistic. I feel like if you want to hear more about what I have to say about Labrys, you should just go watch the Arena Ultimax video, because I would either be repeating myself or just not doing it as much justice as I did then, because I was very fresh on playing it. Labrys has a very tragic backstory. It's very sympathetic. It is easily the most compelling part of that game's story. Despite it being a visual novel, I think it hits really hard and is the main reason why I think that Arena's story specifically would be worth checking out. Although I would recommend doing the bare minimum to unlock it, not paying too much mind to the previous story scenarios, except for maybe like Naoto and Mitsuru's maybe somewhere around here. If I try to rearrange this tier list in like actually a precise order, I would be here for even longer than I've already been here doing this for, so I would pay more mind to what I actually said than maybe the rankings. But hopefully I feel better about this ranking than I did my previous ones in the long term. Go check out my other Persona videos, I would implore you. I know it's compelling to just watch the tier list, but I did try to put a lot of thought into those videos, and I still agree with much of what I had to say in said videos as well, so worth checking out. I do want to thank my channel members, of course, and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.